Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Leave it in the comments section of the page you're viewing before we begin. We are going to explore a mystery that has been around for many generations today. In the heart of Missouri's Ozark Mountains, in the dusty archives of Webster County, lies a mystery. We are discussing the disappearance of two sisters who merely vanished into the mists of those interminable hills, leaving only questions that have yet to be answered, and a neighborhood plagued by stillness. The year was 1882. Missouri was deeply scarred by the Civil War, which was still causing America to heal. Entire families may reside in the Ozarks, a place of untamed beauty and harsh seclusion, where steep valleys and miles of impenetrable forest separated them. There were just dirt paths that wound between the hills covered in walnuts and oak trees. There were no concrete highways. Village-to-village communication was slow, reliant on horse-drawn messengers and mail that only arrived once, a week after it was delivered. The leaves started to turn copper and gold that autumn, and the air had the chilly, humid quality of the mountains. It was harvest season, a time to get ready for the hard winter that lay ahead. Families restocked on food, fixed fences, and killed animals. Although life was difficult, people were united by a feeling of community. Until that fateful October, everyone thought that, nonetheless. Margaret and Elelena Caldwell were well known in. The little town of Marshfield was the commercial hub of that rugged area. Eleanor was only 19, and Margaret was 23. As the daughters of a merchant who owned a hardware and general supply store, they hailed from a well-respected family. Since his wife had suffered a particularly harsh summer due to typhoid, their father, Thomas Caldwell, had been a widower for 3 years. All he had left were the daughters, and he guarded them with the zeal of someone who had previously experienced the loss. Margaret was the more practical of the two, with hands worn from working in the warehouse and dark hair that is always pulled back in a tight bun. The youngest, Eleanor, dreamed of larger cities and a life outside of those mountains because of her inquisitive gaze and restless nature. However, they were both committed, devoted, and diligent members of the small Baptist church located in Marshfield Central Square. The sisters told their father they were going on a trip on October 27th of that year. Sarah Brennan, their aunt, about 50 miles to the south in Springfield, lived their mother's older sister, who passed away. A letter that had received the week before stated that Sarah was ill and requested that her nieces be present. Despite requiring 2 days of wagon travel and an overnight stay at an inn along the way, it was a typical journey by the standards of the time. Thomas Caldwell paused. He disliked the thought of his girls touring those meandering roads by themselves, where robberies were rampant, and where the isolation of the pathways might conceal hidden hazards. Margaret, however, persisted, claiming that they were familiar with the road and that they would pass through Seymour before dusk and leave the following morning. Besides, the aunt was sick. They had an obligation to go. Thomas reluctantly consented. He set up the cart, inspected the wheels, and placed enough food for 3 days. Silver pennies stored in a leather purse made up the modest amount of money he handed his daughters. He advised them to stay up to date and avoid talking to strangers, the speed, and that they stay on the main road. Margaret and Elelena Caldwell started off early on October 28th under a hazy sky that threatened to rain. They donned wide-brimmed hats, heavy wool capes to protect them from the cold, and their finest travel gowns. 2 dependable horses that Thomas had bred since Foss pulled the wagon. A number of people waved and wished the sisters a safe journey as they left the city. Nobody thought that this would be the final instance of. Witness them in person, or the final time anyone would confess to seeing them. Through the heart of the Ozarks, The road to Springfield wound through slender valleys where the sun could hardly shine through the tops of the trees. In several places, the trail got so steep that wagons had to travel down slowly while the brakes creaked and the horses warily retreated. The walk was lovely, but it was also dangerous. The road was occasionally crossed by streams, which might become impassable rapids during periods of intense precipitation. On that first day, Margaret and Elelonena ought to have reached Seymour before sunset. The city, a tiny village with 2 guest rooms that took visitors, was about halfway. It was the sensible spot to stop, a secure location for them to rest before finishing the trip. However, nobody had any documentation of the Caldwell sisters' arrival, as darkness fell on October 28th in Seymour. Jeremiah Walsh, the proprietor of the boarding home where they once resided, would subsequently testify that. He found their absence odd and waited for them until 9 o'clock in the evening. Since she was little, she had known the girls. Every time they came through the city, they were given to her. However, the rooms were still unoccupied that evening, so Walsh rented the space to a traveling salesman from Springfield. Aunt Sarah Brennan was waiting in Springfield as well. He waited till the 29th and then the 30th. She started to worry when November 1st rolled around, and the nieces were nowhere to be seen. However, Sarah was bedridden and too frail to. Anything but request that her neighbor telegram Marshfield. After waiting 2 days for the telegraph to reach Thomas Caldwell, the businessman felt as though everything had fallen apart. Somewhere between Marshfield and Springfield, his daughters had vanished. There are deep canyons, thick forests, and an 80-kilometer meandering route. At worst, it had been about a week since the departure, so they could be anywhere. Thomas Caldwell didn't waste any time. He got on his fastest horse early on November 3rd and rode in the same direction. Road his daughters had traveled on 6 days prior. As he rode down the muddy pathways, his eyes searching every corner and every shade among the trees, despair pounded in his breast. The Ozarks' nights were starting to get cold, and autumn was rapidly turning into winter. How long could Margaret and Elelonena last if they were stranded in that verdant area and left out in the cold? He proceeded straight to Jeremiah Walsh's boarding home after riding nonstop to Seymour, arriving at dusk with the horse foaming with fatigue. Validated Thomas's fears. The girls never made it. Soon after, Walsh summoned additional locals. A small group gathered on the muddy roadway in front of the business. The Caldwell sisters were well known to all. The news startled everybody. On a path that was used by dozens of people each week, how could 2 girls simply vanish? Cornelius Black, a middle-aged farmer with a gray beard and large work-streaked hands, claimed to have driven by the road on the afternoon of October 28th, northward from Springfield. There was no cart with 2 women that he could see. This was strange because Black had traveled the entire distance that day, arriving in Seymour by mid-afternoon after departing Springfield at sunrise. Unless they had veered off the main route or something had stopped them well before they reached the halfway mark, the sisters should have met him somewhere along the way if they had left Marshfield in the morning as scheduled. That night, Thomas Caldwell did not get any sleep. He planned a search. Party with Seymour volunteers, and by dawn the following day, roughly 15 mounted men had started to retrace the road northward in search of any indications that something had gone wrong. They called the girls' names until they were horse arse, searched the shoulders, and explored side paths that diverged from the main path. On November 4th, early in the afternoon, the first discovery was made. Wheel marks that led off the main road and down a narrow path were discovered by one of the seekers, a young man named Peter Hutchkins. Trail that descended into an especially thick forest. Deep in the still wet muck, the marks were recent. Hutchkins summoned the others, and everyone agreed on that. There was no particular destination down the side track. It was the kind of trail that hunters took in pursuit of deer and wild animals, or that woodcutters later used to cut timber. The track was entirely engulfed by the growth after a few meters, but the wheel impressions could still be seen occasionally between moss-covered stones and exposed roots. Thomas's. My heart pounded. What was the reason behind his daughter's deviation from the main road? Margaret was familiar with that path. She was too careful to make such an error. They ventured into the forest, following the markings for over a kilometer. The creaking of saddles and the rustle of dead leaves beneath the horses' hoofs were the only sounds to break the eerie calm. There were old trees with thick, ivy-covered trunks and branches that formed a canopy so dense that sunlight was scarcely able to reach the trees. It was the type of setting where one may feel like they were being watched, never entirely vanished. The wagon was then located. It lay on its side in a tiny clearing, the wooden frame half broken, one wheel ripped from its axle. The tying belts were broken or cut, and the horses had vanished. The floor was littered with the food Thomas had prepared, including moldy bread, animal-eaten cheese fragments, and a shattered water bottle. Elelena's dirty, ripped woolen cloak was wrapped in a nearby bush, no sign of the sisters, however. Caldwell Thomas dropped on his knees next to the wagon, clutching his youngest daughter's cloak with trembling hands. Because they all knew what this scene signified, the men surrounding him remained mute. There had been a pretty bad incident. It was no coincidence that the wagon had tipped over or broken down. The girls had been intercepted by someone or something. They spent hours looking through every inch of the clearing and the trees around it. They discovered several clothes items and one of Margaret's half-shoes. They discovered no bodies, but the leather bag that held the money was now empty and buried in the muck. No blood was discovered. The wagon was left there, and they could find no evidence of where Margaret and Elelena had disappeared to. Because the human imagination fills gaps with dread, the lack of answers was nearly worse than discovering the worst. Thomas Caldwell pictured 1,000 horrible outcomes for his girls as he stood there in that soggy and depressing clearing. Were they abducted and taken to a more remote area of the forest? Did some criminal who prowled those mountains still have them as prisoners? There, the men made camp, determined to continue the search as long as it was light. They split off into smaller groups, each of which pursued a distinct course. They called out the sisters' names until the sky grew entirely black and the night was too chilly to go on. When the morning rose on November 5th, all they had discovered were those strewn artifacts, silent witnesses of a calamity that cannot be explained. Cornelius Black, the farmer who had crossed the street 2 days prior to the disappearance, then made a startling comment. He was familiar with that region. He and I both knew that the sidetrack eventually led to an abandoned property, an old log cabin that had belonged to a long-dead hermit. There were rumors of unusual occurrences happening there, and the people had a negative opinion of the place. Visitors that passed close to that area of the woodland reported experiencing eerie feelings. Black had never given these rumors much thought. A pragmatic man, he trusted his senses of sight and touch. However, after observing the broken wagon and Thomas Caldwell's dejected expression, he started to question whether there might not be any truth to those old tales. He proposed that they visit the deserted cottage, and everyone agreed. It was their sole tangible clue. It took over an hour to hike there, over rocky terrain and progressively thicker forest. When they eventually... Everyone had an unexplainable chill when they came out on a tiny hill and saw the cottage surrounded by trees. The structure had collapsed. There were new footprints in the dirt near the entrance, but the roof had partially fallen and the walls were covered with vines. Not women, but boot tracks. The cabin's door swayed slightly in the wind that blew through the woods, hanging from a single old hinge. The other men followed closely behind with lanterns as Thomas Cordwell entered first, pushing the decaying wood with his shoulder. Elevated, long shadows danced on the mold-covered walls as the faint morning light just made it through the gaps in the ceiling that had fallen. It was an intolerable stench. The stomach turned from the combination of dampness, decomposition, and something else, something basic and animal. Dead leaves, branches blown by the wind, and the droppings of wild animals covered the ground, transforming this area into a makeshift shelter. In one corner was a stone fireplace that still held ancient ashes and a rustic. The table fell on its side. Termites ate away at its legs. However, Peter Hutchkins discovered something that chilled him to the bone in the cabin's darkest corner. Margaret Caldwell's outfit when she left Marshfield was the exact same shade as this piece of blue linen. The fabric had torn, and it was stuck on a projecting nail in the wall, like someone had been dragged there. Without saying anything, Hutchkins simply picked up the fragment and brought it to Thomas, who recognized it right away. They looked everywhere in that dilapidated dwelling. In an attempt to find anything hidden, they flipped the tables, flipped the fireplace, and excavated the compacted dirt floor. They discovered a few more unsettling items, old ropes with dark stains that might be blood or just dirt and rust from years of use. Nothing to explain the sisters' current location or the person who brought them there, just empty bottles of cheap alcohol and the remains of past meals. Cornelius Black took a closer look at the tracks outside. They worked a lot and wore heavy boots. Number: an adult man, judging by the length of his stride, presumably powerful. The marks entered and exited the cottage, but they were obscured by the brush there. Whoever had been there was familiar with the woodland and understood how to travel through it without leaving any visible signs. An old guy called August Weber, one of the helpers, proposed that they bring in hunting dogs. On his farm, he kept 3-scent hounds, which were taught to detect raccoons and deer during winter hunts, using something that had been. The canines may be able to follow a trail to the girls, even though it seemed unlikely after so many days, especially considering the rain that had fallen the week before. It was preferable to doing nothing at all. As the others searched the area surrounding the cabin, Weber rode back to his land. He brought the 3 dogs back in the middle of the afternoon. They were big, spotted furred creatures with long, dragging ears. He infused them with the scent of Margaret's peace and Alelina's cloak. Put on clothing. Barking loudly, the scent hounds darted into the woods after making several rounds around the cottage and sniffing vigorously. The men did their best to follow them on horseback, but in places the jungle was too thick, so they had to walk, following the reins as they led the animals. The fact that the dogs kept their snouts fixed to the ground and yanked forcefully southeastward into the Ozarks, where even the most seasoned hunters would have struggled, suggests that they have discovered something. Once ventured, they followed for over 2 miles over ice streams that dampened their ankle boots and down steep ravines. The trees there were different, darker, and covered in lichens that resembled corpse hair hanging from the branches. The pristine forest, which appeared to have never been touched by human hands, was all that was visible. There were no pathways. The dog then stopped suddenly. They were in a low-lying region that resembled a tiny valley with a creek flowing between boulders coated in mosquitoes. The hounds sniffed and circled anxiously. The ground, groaning gently like they did when they sensed something bothering them, but not pushing forward. August attempted to persuade the animals to go on, but they refused. Instead, they sat motionless on the stream's bank, keeping their eyes away from the murky water and their ears down. With his feet digging into the soft mud, Thomas Caldwell descended to the coast. He plunged his palm into the ice-cold water, which was perfectly clear but black due to the tree shadows. Nothing was present. There is clearly a problem here, as there is no indication of any violence or unrest. However, there seemed to be a sensation of heaviness and anticipation in the air, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. In the second clue, Peter Hutchkins discovered it. There were traces of something heavy being pulled in the mud on the other bank a little distance later, when the stream curved sharply. Hutchkins jumped from stone to stone across the pond, almost tripping over the slippery moss, and took a closer look at the marks. They led into a rock formation that climbed beyond the bank, a sort of limestone wall punctuated by fractures and little caverns, and they were new, most definitely within the last week. The men exchanged glances. Nobody wanted to be the first to propose what other people were considering. The Ozarks were home to numerous caves, some of which stretched for miles beneath the mountains. These caverns were mazes of tiny passageways and underground passageways where there was complete darkness and deafening quiet. They were hazardous locations where it was simple to get lost, where the men died from asphyxiation when the air was thin, and they were unaware of the risk until it was too late. However, they had to look into the possibility that Margaret and Eleanor were inside, no matter how remote. Thomas Caldwell made a snap decision. He checked the oil, grabbed one of the flashlights, and started up the stony bank toward the closest entry to the formation. 3 additional volunteers and Cornelius Black trailed behind, with the remainder of the group standing outside, holding the dogs and horses that blatantly refused to go over to the rocks. After a few meters, the cave's small entrance, just a fissure in the stone, widened. There were puddles of water dripping from the roof and loose pebbles all over the uneven floor. The lantern's light made the walls shimmer wet, and the sound of their breathing reverberated oddly, amplified and warped by the sharp edges of the rock. They called out the girls' names as they moved gently forward, testing each step. The haunting echoes of their voices came back. That appeared to come simultaneously from every direction. A maze of tunnels that branched out like veins beneath the mountain caused the trail to split in 2, then 3. Thomas consistently selected the route that appeared to be the most traveled, where the gravel was most compacted, or where he noticed what appeared to be ancient tracks. Thomas stepped on something that wasn't stone when they were maybe 100 yards within the mountain. His heart nearly stopped when he lowered the flashlight. It was a book of prayers. Moisture stains the leather cover, although remains identifiable. It was the same book Eleanor kept in her purse at all times. Her mother gave it to her before she passed away. With shaking hands, Thomas picked it up and turned to the first page, where Eleanor Marie Caldwell's name was written neatly. The book was laying on the ground as though it had been dropped or thrown away during a fight, but they were now certain the females had been there. And the silence grew more unsettling the farther they ventured into that cave. It wasn't only the lack of sound. There was an eerie silence, as though something was sitting in the shadows outside of his flashlights listening. Everything changed when the prayer book was found. No longer were they men searching for nebulous hints. They were tracking on a concrete path that took them farther and farther into the mountain's interior. For a while, Thomas Caldwell held the tiny volume against his chest, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply. He then placed the book inside his coat pocket and continued, his jaw tightened in unwavering resolve. The tunnel started down a steep incline. The soldiers had to move in single file as the walls grew smaller, their shoulders rubbing against the wet stone. This type of arrangement was perilous, said Cornelius Black, directly behind Thomas in a low voice. In the Ozarks, caves were notorious for either abrupt cave-ins when the limestone structure collapsed under the weight of the mountain above, or for pockets where toxic gases gathered. However, no. One advised going back, not when they were so near discovering the answers. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber after another 20 minutes of cautious descent. His lamps could hardly light the far reaches of the room because the ceiling was several meters high. Stalagmites rose from the ground in strange shapes that resembled human figures frozen in agonizing stances, and stalactites hung like the teeth of some monstrous creature. The water continuously trickled from an invisible source, producing a hypnotic, repetitive sound that reverberated across the room. They discovered the camp there. Just the remnants of a fire that had been out for days, nothing particularly fancy. There were a few empty food cans stacked against the wall and a rudimentary blanket composed of animal hides that had not been properly tanned. The air was heavy with the stench of rotten flesh, old smoke, and something more. Something bitter and chemical that made the nostrils itch. Peter Hutchkins observed large grooves in the compacted earth beside the campfire, as well as imprints on the ground. Earth, as though a heavy object had been dragged along the same route several times. When Thomas lit up the walls, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. Scratches on the limestone rock's surface, perhaps hundreds of them. Some were deep enough to have ripped splinters from the stone, while others were shallow. They weren't chosen at random. He convinced himself in his head that they created patterns, vertical lines arranged in groups of 5, as though someone was counting days or attempting to maintain sanity through a mechanical routine of keeping time. There were 63 days, at least 60 organized brands, and an unfinished group of 3. That didn't make logic, though. It had only been a week since Margaret and Elelenina vanished. Given how old those scars were, likely from months or perhaps years ago, someone had been imprisoned in that cave for longer than 2 months. And, assuming they weren't the first, whoever it was wasn't his daughters. Thomas felt the thought strike him like a kick to the stomach. What if Margaret and Elelenina's fate had occurred previously? What if other victims had been hauled into that same mountain, taken to that same woodland, and vanished along that same road? He considered the county records and the tales that occasionally surfaced about tourists who failed to reach their destination. They consistently blamed it on bandits, mishaps, and the harshness of the Ozark's expanse. However, what if nobody had observed a pattern? Cornelius Black discovered something even more unsettling. A rock partially obscures a dark corner of the room. It was a disorganized stack of personal items, including ripped and discolored clothing, various sized shoes, crumpled caps, and empty bags, all arranged haphazardly like hunting trophies or war booty. In order to avoid coming into direct contact with those items steeped in dark history, Black used a stick to delicately turn the pile over. He discovered a pocket watch that stopped permanently at 3:15 and a silver brooch with letters inscribed on it. At the bottom of the pile, nearly hidden beneath layers of decaying material, were a pair of glasses with one of the lenses cracked. Cloth, a bridal gown that has become yellow over time. Black spotted black areas that might have been dried blood as he lifted it up to the flashlight. It was an old-fashioned dress, likely from 15 or 20 years ago, with mother-of-pearl buttons and beautiful lace. How many people had entered that cave? In that neglected location beneath the mountain, how many lives were disrupted? Each man was digesting the horror of that revelation as they stood in silence in front of that macabre mound. They were searching for more than 2 sisters who are missing. They were uncovering a graveyard of lost souls that the Ozarks had concealed for many years. However, they still hadn't located Elelenina and Margaret. Furthermore, the cave did not finish in that chamber. The tunnel that opened on the other side was even smaller than the first one, just wide enough for a man to walk through. Thomas walked over to the door and listened. A very faint, nearly inaudible sound was emanating from inside. A sigh, a groan, or simply the wind blowing through cracks in the stifling quiet of the cave was broken when he called, "Rock," his voice sounding louder than he had intended. "If you are paying attention, Margaret L. Eleanor, please respond." His words were warped, multiplied, and sent bouncing through the dim passageways by the echo before an answer finally appeared after agonizingly long seconds of waiting. Thomas didn't hesitate when he heard a female voice say, "Help!" from the depths of the small tunnel, even though it was so weak that he thought he had imagined it. He was. The lantern ahead illuminated only a few feet of damp rock as he pushed through the narrow opening and entered the tunnel on his side. Behind him, he heard Cornelius Black yelling for caution, but he was already too far away, too preoccupied with the urgent need to get to that voice. One by one, the others trailed behind him as they squeezed through the hallway, their labored breaths resonating in the small area. There seemed to be no end to the tunnel. They had to bend because the ceiling was so low and there was meter after meter of rock pressing from all sides. Over, rubbing their knees against the rough surface, Thomas experienced the claustrophobic sensation of being buried alive, the start of panic. However, he forced the fear from his thoughts and continued. It had to go on. Somewhere in that darkness, his daughter was in need of him. The tunnel then reopened, this time in a smaller room than the last, but with a detail that caused everyone to pause at once. Light was present. There wasn't much, just a slight blue glow from above, passing through a small opening in the cave's ceiling. Daylight. They were near the surface once more, but in a different location from the mountain, possibly miles from the original entrance. And there was a human figure crouched against the wall farthest away from the room. With his heart pounding so hard that it felt like it might explode out of his chest, Thomas ran, nearly tripping over the loose stones. He moved in close, shining the flashlight on the person's face. It was a young lady, or maybe not so young. It's difficult to tell because of the wounds and dirt. Her eyes flickered against the sudden light. Her matted hair fell over her shoulders. Her feet were bare and bleeding. She was wearing rags that had once been decent clothing, and she raised a trembling hand to protect her face. It wasn't Margaret, though. Elena wasn't there. As Thomas got closer, the woman curled up against the wall even more, letting out a low moan from her dry lips. Her skin was as pale as wax, her condition was appalling, and dark flecks of fatigue and fear encircle her sunken eyes. A hoarse whisper escaped his throat when he attempted to speak, and his hands shook uncontrollably. Thomas took off his coat and laid it on his shaking shoulders as he knelt next to her. He said, "It's okay now," even though he was aware that nothing was all right. Even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow because it was obvious that this woman wasn't safe. "We came to get you out of here. You're safe." Not long had it been safe. Cornelius. The woman eagerly drank from Black's canteen, the water trickling down the corners of her mouth and moistening the rags she was wearing. Breathing heavily, he finally stopped drinking and managed to utter a few jumbled words. Thomas gently held her shoulders and said, He comes back, always comes back, cannot, they can't stay here." "Who's coming back?" he asked. However, the woman asked, "Who did this to you? Who brought you to this cave?" Simply gave a fierce shake of her head. She stared at the entrance to the tunnel they had entered, her eyes wide with panic, as though she thought something might suddenly appear out of the darkness. While Thomas attempted to soothe the woman, Peter Hutchkin studied the camera. There was more proof of long-term occupancy. A latrine was evidently located in one corner, and even with the ventilation from the ceiling crack, the sickening stench was still noticeable. Food scraps and shells from various objects were strewn about. That resembled small animals' gnawed bones, roots, or tubers. Prisoners were fed by whoever kept them there, but only enough to keep them alive. Then Hutchin noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Deep into the limestone fissures were currents that were fastened to the rock wall by iron hooks. The chains were not long enough to reach the tunnel's exit, but they were long enough to permit passage through the chamber. Rust and a darker stain were visible on the links. There was even an open handcuff dangling from one of the chains. The end, the worn metal where someone had repeatedly rubbed against the stone, possibly in an attempt to get away. A thin, bruised ankle was inside the closed handcuff of the other chain. Hutchkins called out, "Thomas?" His voice strained. They fled to the opposite side of the room, where the shadows were more intense, saying, "There's someone else here." Another figure was there, half concealed by a rock formation. Curled up in the fetal position, her face turned to the wall, she was still. As Thomas got closer to the flashlight, he saw the dark green dress, which was even ripped and filthy instantly. Margaret was wearing her travel attire. He cried, "Margaret!" and dropped to his knees beside his daughter, carefully turning her. He pushed his fingers on her neck, and although she was unconscious, she was breathing, and her pulse was weak but present. His brown hair was stuck to the dried blood from a severe wound on his forehead. Her hands were frigid to the touch, and her lips were stained. How much time had she spent there? In that chilly, wet darkness, chained? Cornelius Black was already working on the handcuff, striking the weakest link in the chain with a big rock. After multiple strikes, the ancient metal eventually broke way, releasing Margaret's ankle. With tears burning in his eyes, Thomas held her close to his chest as he raised her in his arms. One of his daughters had been located. However, where had Elelena gone? Now that she had water, the unidentified woman started talking more clearly and realized they weren't there to harm her. He stole the newest female, the other one, 2 or 3 days ago. I couldn't remember. She gestured to the tunnel on the opposite side of the room, a black hole partially obscured by a rock fold that no one had previously spotted. With a broken voice, Thomas screamed, "Where did you take it?" "My other daughter, where are you?" the woman muttered, now trembling furiously. "Deeper. The younger ones are always taken deeper. Where no one can hear, where the underground river rushes." I heard her yelling for 2 days, followed by quiet. Just quiet. The world seemed to be spinning around Thomas. Carefully passing Margaret into Cornelius Black's arms, he stood a little dazed. "Stay with them," he commanded in a steel-cold voice. "Get this woman and Margaret out of here. Bring them to the cave's entrance. Elelena will be with me." "Don't be insane, Thomas." Black objected. "You have no idea what you'll discover down there. What happens if this man, whoever he is present? You're worn out and disarmed." "That's my daughter down there." Thomas interrupted, and Black retreated a step because of something in his gaze. It was a mix of instinctive rage and despair, the look of a father with nothing left to lose. "I won't leave her behind, not as long as there's a possibility she's still alive." Peter Hutchkins moved to the front. "Then I'll accompany you. You cannot travel alone." Thomas started to object, but Hutchkins cut him off with a hard motion. "My sister vanished 7 years ago in the Ozark. We were never able to locate her. I'll go if there's an opportunity to learn what happened to her." A silent agreement passed between the two men as they gazed at one another for a considerable amount of time. Thomas then gave a nod. He examined his flashlight, grabbed another one from a volunteer, and headed toward the dim tunnel. Hutchkins trailed behind, and the two of them vanished into the night, leaving the other women to tend to the women who had been saved. The slope at which the tunnel dropped was steeper than anything they'd encountered thus far. When they needed to hold themselves, the smooth, polished walls from thousands of years of water flow were slippery under their palms. The sound the woman had described started to come into focus. Somewhere far below, there was a persistent, dull roar. As she'd described, flowing water, a subterranean river. They descended forever. In the dark womb of the mountain, where time has lost its meaning, it is impossible to know if it has been 20 minutes or an hour. With every meter, the humidity of the air increased, loaded with steam and that distinct mineral odor of deep water that was never exposed to sunlight. The lanterns created hideous shadows on the walls, and Thomas repeatedly believed he saw people in the rock formations, before realizing they were deceptive tricks of fear and light that made him feel sick to his stomach. Then the tunnel came to an abrupt end, revealing a huge cave that was too big for his spotlights to illuminate. The river that ran underground. In the middle, the water was swift and black, and the sound of its smash on invisible rocks reverberated through the walls. The moisture-filled, chilly air reached the bones. A human figure was hunched over something on the ground on the riverbed, illuminated by tar lamps embedded in the rock walls. The individual was unaware of their approach. Any sound of breathing or walking is muffled by the river's roar. He was a man. His broad frame and stance, along with his dark and damaged attire, made this evident. Clothing that appeared to be composed of poorly sewed patches. As she worked on something Thomas couldn't see well from that distance, her long, matted hair fell over her slumped shoulders. Thomas started to move rashly, but Hutchkins grabbed his arm and stopped him. They had to exercise caution and consider the circumstances before taking any action. The man was in his domain, big, and most likely strong. He was familiar with every nook and cranny of that subterranean cathedral. If they make one mistake, they might die or worse. Like the other victims, stuck there indefinitely. In spite of the fear that threatened to immobilize him, Thomas forced himself to think clearly and to breathe calmly. He scanned the cave with his eyes, searching for benefits, ways out, anything they might utilize. There were other structures visible due to the light thrown by the torches. A primitive table with tools all around, objects that gleamed, and what seemed like crude cages made of wood and wire, some empty, others with shapes that might be people or just mounds of rags. In the flickering light, menacing, Thomas then noticed that the man had moved away from his task. Her youngest daughter, Elelena, was laying on a level rock close to the river, her arms bound to her sides with heavy ropes. She remained still, her hair dispersed like a dark halo around her head, her blue garment in ruins. Thomas was unable to determine whether she was still alive or breathing, and the uncertainty was worse than any torment. The man whispered something, words that echoed but could not be understood, oddly in the cave, blending with the river's noise. As if in a ritual, he moved his hands in specific patterns over Elelena's motionless body, stroking her in ways that caused the rage to burst like liquid fire in Thomas's chest. He was unable to control himself anymore. He screamed in a voice he didn't even recognize as his own when he escaped Hutchins' hold and fled. The savage howl of a parent defending his children. Startled, the man whirled around, and Thomas noticed his face for the first time in the torchlight. It was a mask of loneliness and insanity. His skin was covered in open wounds that never fully healed, old scars, and a dirty beard that reached his chest. His sunken eyes shone with a terrible intensity. The man appeared unfrightened. Instead, a slow, dreadful smile that showed missing and decayed teeth appeared on his face. "More visitors," he replied, with a faint mountain accent in an unexpectedly refined voice. "It has been a while because I've had a lot of visitors. It used to be very lonely in the caverns." Thomas remained silent. It came directly at him, but the man was swift for his size. After avoiding the initial strike, he grabbed Thomas by the coat and violently hurled him against the rocks. Points of light exploded behind Thomas's eyes, and he felt air being forced out of his lungs. The man was already on top of him, with enormous hands clamping down on his throat as he attempted to stand up. Hutchkins took action at that moment. He grabbed a torch from the wall and used all his strength to strike the man in the back. The man shouted, dropping Thomas and turning to confront this new assailant as the flames crackled as it touched the greasy fabric of the clothing. Hutchkins retreated, holding the torch ahead as a weapon, keeping his distance as Thomas caught his breath. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice now almost reasonable, as if he were explaining something obvious to stubborn children. "They come to me, I am sent by mountains. They did it every time. I moved here when my family was destroyed by fire, and the caves welcomed me after I was kicked out of the city, showed me the rivers that flow where no one can see them, the hidden roots." Ignoring the flames rising up the back of his coat, he took a stride in Hutchkins' direction. "Down here, I look after them. I provide food and water. They're not by themselves. They will never have to be by themselves again. And the water carries them when they are at the finish, when they are prepared. The river always transports it to a better place than this harsh reality." At last, Thomas was able to stand up, coughing and feeling his throat burn from the pressure of the man's fingers. With a relief that nearly caused him to pass out, he glanced at Elelena and noticed that she had shifted, her head tilted slightly to the side. She was still alive. There was yet time. "Hutchkins," his voice called. The man's shrill, cracked chuckle echoed through the cave's walls as he said, "Take Elelena. I hold him. No one has caught anything. She's mine now, like the others were mine, as you will also be," he said, moving straight toward the spot where Elelena was bound to the stone rather than toward Hutchkins or Thomas. Thomas lunged forward, stopping the man before he could reach his daughter, and they collided in a tangle of limbs rolling across the rocky ground, each vying for the upper hand. The man was stronger, hardened by years of living in that underground solitude, but Thomas struggled with the force of. Hutchkins ran to Elelena and started cutting the ropes that bound her with a knife he had taken from his belt. The blade was dull, and the fibers were thick and tough, but he soared off with frantic determination as the struggle continued behind him. Eleanor opened her eyes, confused, and tried to scream, but her throat was too dry to make a sound. "I'm your father's," Hutchkins hurriedly muttered. "We come to rescue you out of here, friend. Keep quiet." Elelena was free after the last rope broke. Hutchkins helped her sit up, but she was too weak to stand by herself. Days of complete terror and a lack of food and water had sapped all of his strength, so he turned his head when he heard something break. Thomas and the man were now dangerously close to the riverbank, their silhouettes dancing in the torchlight. Thomas had taken a stone and used it. "The river always takes," he sang now, a meaningless melody down and away, where the roots of the mountain meet the heart of the earth. "You will see. You will all see." Then, in a sudden movement, the man grabbed Thomas by the arms and lifted him up. For a terrible moment, Hutchkins thought he was going to throw Thomas into the river, into the black, violent river. He twisted in the air, managed to get a leg behind the man, and they both lost their balance, falling together. But the man hit the rocky bank first, his head slamming against a sharp rock with a sickeningly wet sound, and he stood motionless for a second, 2, 3. Then his eyes blinked, focused on Thomas leaning over him, and that smile returned one last time. "The river always takes it," he whispered. "And there are always more travelers on the road," he said, blood trickling down the corner of his mouth. For a terrifying moment he believed that they would both fall into the river and be dragged by the black waters to the unknown depths of the mountain, but he was able to hold on just in time. His hands went up, grabbed Thomas's coat, and with one last desperate effort pulled it out. Thomas felt the world tilt as the man pulled him in, his feet slipping on the wet rock of the bank. The man was not so fortunate. His hold on Thomas's coat loosened, his fingers losing strength as the head wound finally reached him, and he slid back, his eyes still fixed on Thomas with that expression of serene madness, until the current caught him. There was no shout, no final protest, just silence as the black water engulfed him, dragging his body down the river until he vanished entirely into darkness. With his hands still clinging to the rock, Thomas stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, unable to comprehend what had happened. Hutchkins called his name, bringing him back to reality. He crawled away from the shore, shivering not only from shock, but also from cold, and staggered to where Hutchkins was supporting Alelina, her youngest daughter, who was now conscious but could hardly keep her eyes open. When she saw her father, tears streamed down her filthy cheeks, and she uttered, "Daddy!" "We've got to get out of here," Hutchkins said urgently. "We don't know if there are others, and those torches won't last forever." He looked around the cave at the gloomy cages, at the table with its sinister tools, and at the river that continued its relentless flow as if nothing had happened. Thomas hugged her, holding her so tightly that she moaned in pain, but he couldn't let go. He had lost everything once when his wife died, and she couldn't bear to lose her daughters either. "Help those who are still alive," Thomas nodded, forcing himself to act despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. Together, they examined the cages and discovered 2 women, both in appalling condition but breathing. One was unconscious, while the other simply stared into space with eyes that seemed to see nothing else. How many days or months had they been there? Their clothing varied in style, and from different eras. One wore a dress that appeared to have. The one who was conscious shrank as Hutchkins approached, moaning softly, but he spoke softly, explaining that they were there to help and that the man who was holding them prisoner was gone. It took time for her to believe it, to allow herself to be touched. The trauma etched in her eyes was so deep that Thomas doubted she would ever fully recover. The other, wearing rags that barely covered her emaciated body, had once been beautiful. Hutchkins offered to run back to the chamber where they left the others to bring more people. Ropes, makeshift stretchers. Thomas would stay there with the women, making sure they were safe until rescue arrived. As Hutchkins vanished up the tunnel, moving with the desperate speed of someone who knows the urgency of the situation, Thomas sat down on the stone floor and pulled Alelina into his arms. She trembled uncontrollably, and he removed his own coat to wrap around this woman. Margaret was safe upstairs with Cornelius Black. Alelina was here, alive in his arms. They had persevered against all odds. His daughters had survived. However, when Thomas looked at the other women at the empty cages at the table with instruments whose purpose he did not want to imagine, he realized that they had found something much larger and more horrible than a straightforward case of 2 missing sisters. How many people had that man captured over the years? He picked up travelers on the road, always the same, women alone or in small pairs, and he claimed that the mountains spoke to him, told him who to catch. He dragged the carts into the forest, hid the horses, and erased the tracks. No one ever looked for it, right? A lot of people still lay somewhere in the depths of that mountain, their bodies carried by the underground river to unknown graves. His voice was a broken whisper. She coughed, a dry, painful cough that shook her weak body. "I'm from Indiana. My husband and I were traveling to Arkansas to buy land when we stopped at night in a clearing. He instructed me to get water from the stream. When I returned, he was dead, with a cut throat, and this man was there. It pulled me into the caves. That was in June. What year are we?" 1882, Thomas said softly. "November." The woman closed her eyes, silent tears. Alelina shifted in Thomas's arms, her voice weak but determined. "Margaret," she whispered. "Where's Margaret?" He said he was going to take me to the river, but first he wanted me to see where Margaret would be. I pulled him, tore off a piece of her face, and he brought others after me. 5 months down here, she said. 5 months down here, and he brought others after me. I saw 3 arrive. 1 did not survive the first week. I don't remember anything else until I woke up tied to that rock. Thomas kissed Margaret's forehead and reassured her that she was safe. We found her in a chamber higher up. He was unconscious but breathing. Cornelius Black was taking care of her. You'll both be fine. I promise you'll be fine. However, even as he said those words, Thomas questioned whether any of them would ever be truthful. How did someone recover from something like that? How did they trust the world? The sound of voices reverberated through the tunnel, signaling the Hutchkins' return with reinforcements. Cornelius Black arrived first, followed by 3 other men carrying ropes and blankets, bringing food and fresh water, and news that Margaret had woken up and was asking for her sister. They organized the rescue with efficiency born of necessity, carrying women who could not walk and supporting those who could. Sleep without nightmares. Travel along roads without paralyzing terror that every shadow hid a monster. They started the long journey back through the tunnels, slowly ascending toward the daylight, which took hours. The narrow passages made it difficult to maneuver with unconscious people, and several times they had to stop to rest to allow the women to regain enough strength to continue. However, after what seemed like an eternity, they finally saw the faint glow of natural light filtering through the cave entrance. Thomas carried Elelenina himself, refusing to let anyone else touch his daughter. The men who had been waiting outside erupted in cheers at the sight of the rescued, rushing to help, offering more water and blankets. Margaret stood there, supported by August Weber, her face pale but her eyes clear and focused, when he saw Elelenina in her father's arms. When they finally stepped outside, the sun had already set, painting the Ozark sky in shades of blood red and deep purple. The cold night air had never looked so sweet, so clean, so absolutely precious. Arms, he let out a cry of relief and attempted to run to them, but his legs gave way. Thomas gently lowered Elelenina to the ground and hugged both daughters, the 3 clinging to each other as tears flowed freely. The trip back to Marshfield was slow and depressing. They made stretches out of blankets and branches for the weakest women, and the procession wound through the Ozark trails like a silent funeral procession. Night fell completely short before they reached Seymour, and Jeremiah Walsh opened his entire. A doctor was called from the nearby town and arrived at dawn on November 6th. A middle-aged man with gentle hands and eyes who had witnessed too much human suffering to be easily shocked, but even he was visibly shaken as he examined the victims, seeing the marks on their wrists and ankles where the chains had bitten into the flesh, the bruises that told stories of hardship. Boarding house to house the rescued, refusing any payment, and insisting that his wife prepare hot soup and tea for everyone. Margaret and Elelenina were in better shape than the others because they had been in the man's clutches for a shorter period of time. Margaret suffered a concussion from the blow to her head, but Dr. Garrett reassured her that she would fully recover with rest. Elelenina was severely malnourished and dehydrated, and her feet were cut and infected from walking barefoot over sharp stones, but nothing that time and care couldn't heal physically at least. Wounds would take a lot longer. The other 2 women who were pulled from the cages were in critical condition. The Indiana woman, who claimed to be Catherine Morton, was physically stable, but the girl who had been unconscious, a girl of maybe 25 with matted red hair, had a high fever during the night and was battling several infections. Dr. Garrett worked feverishly to bring her back, putting cold compresses on her throat and forcing liquids down her throat as she raved on tongues no one could identify. The men gathered in the boarding house's main hall to make a decision, while the women rested under the care of Walsh's wife and Dr. Garrett. However, mentally destroyed, he sat in a chair in the corner of his room, staring into space and answering questions with monosyllables when he answered. Dr. Garrett privately told Thomas that he had seen that look before in soldiers returning from war, in people who had witnessed atrocities that broke something fundamental within them. Some recovered in time, while others never fully recovered. Their next course of action was to fully investigate those caves, map the passageways, search for additional victims who might still be alive in some undiscovered chamber, and locate the bodies. Cornelius Black brought up the point that everyone was avoiding. The river always takes it. If he has been tossing bodies into the underground river for years, where do they go? Those waters. August Weber, who knew the Ozarks better than any man in attendance, shook his head slowly and said, "There are dozens of underground rivers in these mountains. Some run for miles before emerging, while others simply disappear into sinkholes so deep that no one has ever explored to the bottom. If this man had been disposing of bodies like this for years, they could be anywhere or somewhere else. Maybe in some bigger cave or in a spring, or even back to the open river somewhere further down in the mountains." The idea was unsettling. How many families would never know what happened to their loved ones? How many fathers would pass away without knowing if their daughters had been murdered or just lost on some far-off road? The Ozarks were large. The records were incomplete. Intercount communication was slow and unreliable, and it would be extremely difficult to correlate disappearances over years or even decades. But they had to try. Thomas suggested that they send messages to all nearby counties requesting records of missing people. When Sheriff Eden Price received the urgent message, he rode hard from Marshfield to Seymour on the afternoon of November 6th. He was a tall, thin man with a gray mustache and hawk-like eyes that didn't miss details. If they could identify victims through the objects found in the cave and establish a pattern, perhaps they could bring some closure to families who suffered without answers. It was the least they owed to the dead. Story asked specific questions and took notes in a battered leather notebook. After Thomas was done, Price remained silent for a while, taking in the enormity of what he had heard. "We need to form an official team," he said at last, adding that he needed to bring together lawyers from different counties and possibly even a state government representative. This crime is not limited to the local area. This man crossed several jurisdictions if he had been doing business along that road for years. Additionally, we require individuals with cave exploration experience, not merely volunteers with good intentions. Over the next few days, Seymour found itself at the epicenter of a huge operation. Arriving were deputies, sheriffs from nearby counties, and even a reporter from the Springfield newspaper who scribbled frenzied notes while interviewing everybody who wanted to talk. Like fire in a parched forest, the tale started to spread throughout the Ozarks. The predator that lurked beneath the earth and preyed on defenseless visitors was the caveman, the monster of the mountains. Thomas and Cornelius Black were among the 12 members of the party who returned to. On November 8th, in the caves. This time, well prepared with long ropes, extra lanterns, crude maps, and fresh bravery. They marked pathways, cataloged everything they discovered, and spent 3 days investigating every chamber and corridor. They found more horrors than they had anticipated. Unceremoniously stacked up like discarded junk were chambers that were obviously temporary jails, walls that were marked with more of those desperate tallies of days, and a smaller room that was filled with bones, not all of them human, but many of them were. Sufficient. Personal items to fill 3 sizable trunks, including jewelry, wallets, clothing, shoes, and letters that were never mailed but were penned by shaking hands pleading for an unattainable ransom. They discovered what seemed to be the man's residence while he wasn't hunting on the surface in a particularly deep chamber. There were shelves built into the rock with stolen food, a bed made of animal skins, and even some musty books that implied that man was not entirely wild and that he still had some vestiges of education or humanity in spite of his heinous actions. One of the volumes was a Bible, with tiny, cramped handwriting and stains on the pages. They weren't coherent notes. Passages from the Bible interspersed with meanderings about salvation and purification, about how the river accepted the sacrifices that the mountains selected. It served as a glimpse into a mind that had been utterly ruined, someone who had created a perverted theology to defend crimes. However, they searched far and wide, but were never able to locate the man's own body, the underground. As he had stated, the river had swept him and everyone else to uncharted depths. They wouldn't be aware of his identity, background, or the events that turned him from a man into a monster. His life before to that would remain a mystery, although there were hints strewn about the cave that indicated he had resided there for at least 15 years, if not more. Eventually, in one of her more lucid periods, Catherine Morton gave some more information. According to him, the man occasionally discussed a fire, losing his family, about getting kicked out of a city because of something he did or was suspected of doing. However, the information was imprecise, filtered via her anguish and his lunacy, making it impossible to confirm. Over the next few weeks, the Ozarks became a site of widespread grief and heartbreaking discoveries. Sheriff Price compiled accounts of disappearances dating back to 1867 and coordinated efforts with officials in 8 other counties. The regularity of the emerging pattern was scary. About each, someone would vanish in that specific area of the mountains after 6 to 8 months. Constant travelers, mostly always women, and sometimes couples in which the lady vanished without a trace and the guy was discovered dead. A room given by the Marshfield Baptist Church was converted into a temporary identification hall where the artifacts retrieved from the caves were cataloged and displayed. Families traveled for days from far-off counties, hoping and frightened at the same time to see something that belonged to the loved ones they were missing. Everyone's hearts were broken by the parade of desperate and optimistic faces. While visiting family in Springfield in 1874, an elderly Camden County woman identified a silver brooch bearing the initials G.H. as that of her daughter Grace, who had gone missing. On a bright April morning, Grace, then 21 years old, headed away with the intention of returning in a week. He never came back. The mother, her hands shaking with age and enthusiasm and her hair now almost white, held the brooch to her chest and sobbed tears that had been pent up for 8 years. A farmer from Ellet County discovered a pocket watch that belonged to his younger brother, who vanished in 1877 with his fiancée, 3 days prior to their scheduled nuptials. The bodies were never discovered, but the abandoned wagon and the horses grazing through the forest were. The farmer, a big man with strangled voice and calloused hands, claimed to have hired trackers, looked for months, and offered a prize. It had never occurred to him that his, less than 15 miles from where the cart had been discovered, brother was lying in a subterranean chamber. Cornelius Black discovered a yellowed bridal dress that turned out to be that of Elizabeth Whitmore, a young woman from Stone County who had vanished in 1868. 3 days after going missing, her fiancé was discovered wandering through the woods in shock, his head sliced open by a vicious blow. Only unsettling shards of Elizabeth's form emerging from the trees remained in his recollection of that day. Shrieking from the shadows, people had either killed his fiancé himself or believed he was lying. He had spent the last 14 years in a city that had never truly forgiven him, surrounded by distrust. He had arrived too late to make up for the years he had wasted beneath that unfair shadow. But at last there was proof of his innocence. The tales accumulated, each item exposing a tragedy, each identification reopening scars that some families had assumed had healed with time. The article was written by the Springfield Reporter. Newspapers in Missouri and nearby states soon started publicizing the tale after the publication of one piece after another. They referred to him as the underground predator, the monster of the Ozarks. The sensationalism of the titles increased, but the gruesome core stayed the same. In Marshfield, Margaret and Eleanina Caldwell were recuperating at their father's house. Both became better physically every day thanks to the diligent care of neighbors and churchgoers who alternated between bringing food, changing bandages, and providing silence. Companionship when the girls were unwilling to speak. However, the evenings were challenging. Eleanina screamed as she awoke, remembering memories that her brain was frantically attempting to erase. Margaret would gaze out the window for hours on end, her expressions incomprehensible to Thomas as she observed the distant line of trees. In December, Aunt Sarah Brennan, whose illness had led to the tragic journey, was well enough to visit Marshfield. She sobbed as she gave her nieces hugs and begged for their forgiveness for being the go-between. Reason for so much pain. Sarah would live with that guilt for the rest of her life, despite Margaret and Eleanina's assurances that there was nothing to forgive. Dr. Garrett took care of Indiana's wife, Catherine Morton, in Seymour for over a month. Considering that he had been held captive for 5 months, his physical recuperation was impressive, but his mental state remained disjointed. He ate less, spoke less, and sat for hours on end, staring at his hands as though they weren't his. She was eventually picked up by relatives who had been found in Fort Wayne. They took a seemingly empty woman, a shell from which her former self would never fully emerge. The young woman with red hair never recovered from her sickness. On November 10th, she passed suddenly due to infections that her frail body was unable to combat. No one has ever been able to identify her plain tombstone, which said, "Only unknown. Rest in peace." She was buried in Seymour Cemetery. Among the items there were insufficient personal effects, discovered in the cave that matched her description exactly, and no family members showed up to look for her. It was possible that he had no family at all, or that he had journeyed so far that his loved ones would never hear the news. Nameless and alone, she passed away like she had in the previous months, but for the presence of strangers who, despite not knowing her, wept for her. On January 1st, 883, the formal investigation came to a close. Sheriff Price's final report, a 37-page document painstakingly scribbled. 23 documented examples of disappearance that might be directly connected to the caveman through recovered artifacts were listed in the document. 15 further instances were categorized as likely but not yet confirmed. Given how many disappearances in rural regions went unreported, there was concern that the true figure was significantly higher. How many individuals roamed the Ozarks without leaving any documentation? Human remains were found in 3 of the compartments, according to the investigation. Investigated. And specialists called in from St. Louis analyzed the bones and concluded that they belonged to at least 12 different people, if not more. While some were clearly older, others were more recent. All displayed trauma-related symptoms that were consistent with violence. Together, they were laid to rest in a designated area of Marshfield Cemetery, designated by a modest monument that Thomas Caldwell himself funded. The caves were formally sealed with the inscription, "To the lost souls of the Ozarks, forgotten but no longer alone." In February, for weeks, men labored to block tunnels with boulders and demolish entrances with strategically set explosives, preventing future treasure seekers or morbidly curious people from desecrating that tomb of horrors. Only a small entry remained open, guarded by a locked iron barrier with a plaque alerting people of the tragedy and advising them to show respect. Even that entrance would eventually be forgotten as the encroaching foliage engulfed it, leaving the underground chambers to be revisited. The quiet they experienced prior to being imprisoned, However, the Ozarks never completely reverted to their previous state, even after the cave was sealed and the monster was killed. Even if it meant taking longer trips, travelers started to steer clear of particular roadways. Male escorts were now required by families that had previously let their girls to travel with just their sisters or acquaintances. Because people opted to stop more frequently in safe locations rather than risky ones, inns along the main roads started to see an increase in business. Camps, and, as often occurs when genuine tragedy blends with popular imagination, the stories developed as they were told. The truth was buried beneath layers of legend after the facts were inflated, details were made up, and the terror was heightened. Ozark children were raised on tales of the caveman, imaginative depictions in which he was a red-eyed behemoth, a demon sent forth by mountain witches, or the vindictive ghost of some ancient evil. The truth, which was just a broken man who preferred monster than facing his own suffering, was lost in folklore. The Ozarks saw gradual changes as the years went by, but the wounds from that awful autumn of 1818, too, never entirely healed. Life continued as usual, but now it was burdened by memories that would not go away, no matter how hard individuals tried to go on. In 1885, Thomas Caldwell sold his hardware business. She was unable to gaze at those shelves without recalling the day she had stocked the cart with supplies, inspected the wheels, and got it ready for her girls. Something she believed would be sufficient to protect them. He relocated to a smaller northern town with Margaret and Eleanor, far from the mountains that had nearly engulfed his family. Margaret toiled alongside him in the modest fabric warehouse he founded, her deft hands measuring yards of cotton and silk for clients who would never hear his tale. Eleanor didn't get married. For 2 years, she had been courted gently by a young man, the son of the village blacksmith, who respected her silence and her worries while patiently waiting for her to regain your trust. Ultimately, though, Elelena decided to live a different life. In order to dedicate her talents to educating young people who might never have to experience the horrors she had, she became a teacher at a school for girls. His diaries, which he kept locked in a drawer at night, contained words he would never reveal to anybody. It was a method of processing trauma for which there was neither a label nor a suitable remedy in the medical field at the time. In 1887, Margaret wed a quiet widower with 2 little children in need of a mother. It wasn't a marriage marked by intense passion, respect for one another, and a determination to continue on in spite of the scars each of them bore. She was a kind but strict mother to her stepchildren, and when she had children of her own, she never allowed them to go anywhere by themselves until they were mature enough to protect themselves. Her grandchildren would perceive her as extremely protective, but they would never completely comprehend why. Catherine Morton's sanity was never fully restored. She lived her final life, years in a facility in Indiana, where nuns tried their best to soothe a mind that was irreparably damaged. She was only 34 when she passed away in 1891, but she appeared decades older due to experiences that she was unable to understand or erase. The nun beside him said that his final words were, "Over the river that always leads, the river that finally took her too." The Webster County Sheriff's Office held the case files, voluminous testimonies, reports, and lists of retrieved items. In a subsequent interview, Edmund Price, who retired in 1896, stated that this case tormented him more than any other in his 30 years of law enforcement, not because of the brutality per se, but rather because of its systematic loneliness. A man by himself in the depths of the ground, constructing his own perverted universe in which he was both God and demon, determining who survived and who perished based on reasoning that only his fractured mind could comprehend. For decades, the cave's shut entrances were gradually absorbed. by vegetation until they were only visible to those who knew where to look. The caution sign fell off due to rust. It was never swapped out. The next generation only heard warped tales after the generation that had experienced the terror perished. As old maps vanished and memories faded, even the precise location eventually became hazy. Fascinated by the stories that were still being told about the caveman, a group of young cave explorers from local institutions attempted to locate the entrance in 1923. They spent 2 full weeks looking, but the sealed tunnels were never discovered. Maybe it was better that the mountains guarded their secrets so effectively. Some areas ought to be left alone. It's best to let some tragedies fester in the dark, out of harm's reach. At the age of 79, Thomas Caldwell passed away in 1912. As he quietly fell into his last sleep, Eleanor and Margaret were at his side, holding his hands. In his final cognizant words, he thanked God for giving him a few more years with his daughters, and for allowing them to survive. Situations may have easily been stolen. He was finally reunited with his wife, whom he had lost to fever so many years before, and was buried beside her. The caves and the rescue were not mentioned in the gravestone. All it stated was, "Rest in peace, merchant and loving father, Thomas Caldwell." Eventually, the case's official papers were moved to the state archives, where they are still yellowed and fragile today. Historians interested in historical crimes from the border regions occasionally review these records. Today's youth read the records with sick interest, attempting to comprehend how such crimes occurred in eras before instantaneous communication, before a unified police force, and when the size of the mountains allowed monsters to operate covertly for years without being found. However, it was never about fascination for those who survived and experienced the visceral fear of those November days in 1882. It was about loss and trauma, about trust being betrayed and innocence being lost. It dealt with the awful frailty of human life and how easily it may be put out by the whim of one person who is overwhelmed by evil. In it, the Ozark's beautiful and merciless hidden mysteries behind their limestone depths that might never be fully discovered. The caverns are still closed up. In its depths, the subterranean river continues to flow, delivering icy black waters through passageways that have been invisible to the naked eye for over a century. Whether bones remain in those abandoned rooms, whether victims' personal things remain, have never been named, nobody is aware of them, and perhaps nobody ought to be. Certain mysteries are best kept hidden, and some cemeteries should not be desecrated. In 1941, Margaret Caldwell passed away. Eleanor in 1947. Neither of them ever publicly discussed the suffering they endured in those caves, and they both carried their complete recollections of those dreadful days to their graves. Some pains are too great to describe, and some experiences are too weighty to express. The sisters were interred next to one another in the city's tiny cemetery. Their peaceful existence. The plain gravestones don't mention the remarkable hardships they endured as children. Despite the minor human tragedies that are taking place on their slopes, the Ozarks continue to live their lives. Rivers run, trees grow, and the seasons shift. Those roads are still used by travelers, but they are now driven by cars rather than horse-drawn carts. Most people are unaware that they are passing close to a locked tomb where dozens of lost souls rest in perpetual darkness. Their tales were relegated to local history footnotes, books that not many people read. However, we do recall. We recall because we ought to. Eleanor and Margaret, who lived when so many others perished, are remembered. We recall the nameless, red-haired young woman and Catherine Morton. We commemorate everyone whose items have been identified as well as those whose names have vanished entirely. Because their lives mattered, their agony was genuine, and forgetting them would be the greatest betrayal, we remember them. We also keep in mind that monsters exist, not mythical animals from the mountains or fairy tales, but people who prefer the dark, who construct terrifying realms in the shadows where they believe no one will discover them. We never forget to be watchful, to defend the weak, and to never think that just because we live in a contemporary or civilized world, tragedy cannot occur. The Ozark caves are still locked. Over a century has passed since the guy who converted them into a prison died. Waters with no secrets took his body away. However, his tale lives on as a sobering reminder of both the terrible and resiliency, both terror and bravery. Please think about subscribing to our channel if this journey through one of the most unsettling periods in American history has affected you in any way, if you have felt the weight of the lives lost and those who persevered in the face of overwhelming adversity. We continue to honor memories that time attempts to destroy by resurrecting lost tales. If you think these tales should be told, please leave a like. Tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section as well. Each and every viewing, comment, and subscriptions enable us to keep up this historical preservation effort. Take care of yourself until the next tale is told, and never forget that history, no matter how terrible, should be remembered.